Hello everyone. In today's video, I'm going to tell you about tanks, the history of tanks. And as always, I hope you find this topic interesting. Two quick things before we begin. The first thing is that you are invited again to participate in a survey and let me know which topic you would like to hear about in one of my next videos. You will find a list of 6 possible options in the description of this video, and you can vote for one of them in the comments. You have until the end of February to vote, and as always I will record the winning topic in English, in Spanish, and in French. The other thing is that I keep trying to improve the audio quality of my videos. So for this one I have completely changed my recording setup, and I hope the quality of the sound is going to be better. So I would like to have your feedback about that, if you find the sound better, the same, or worse maybe, so that I can keep making adjustments looking forward. Okay, it's now time to begin our story. As usual, I'm going to show you a few pictures, but you don't need them to understand what follows, so if you prefer, you may just close your eyes and listen. The first tanks were designed and built in the 20th century, and we're going to see in this video how they evolved with the technology, the needs on the battlefields, but they correspond to a much more ancient need in a war situation, the need to provide troops with protection, mobility, and firepower. For that reason, the person that is sometimes credited for having invented the concept of the tank is Leonardo da Vinci. Centuries before the first tank appeared on a battlefield, he imagined a round wooden structure that would have been able to protect a crew of several men against enemy fire, and this structure on wheels would have been able to move on the battlefield to fire in every direction and offer protection against the enemies. Even though this invention was actually never built, it remained a sketch on paper. All the tactical elements that define a tank were already present: the mobility, the protection, and the firepower. However, it is only at the beginning of the 20th century that several technical innovations started to make this theoretical concept possible. 3 inventions in particular. The first one is the internal combustion engine, which would provide the necessary mobility to the vehicle. The steam engines were extremely heavy and needed to carry a large quantity of coal to make them work, whereas the appearance, the creation of combustion engine working with hydrocarbons made it possible to generate a lot of power with a limited quantity of fuel and a more limited weight. The second invention is the armor plate. The technology for the production of steel improved dramatically in the 19th century, and this continued in the 20th century, making it possible to create steel plates that were very resistant and relatively light in comparison with what they were in the early stages of the Industrial Revolution. And finally, a third invention, the caterpillar, or the continuous track, which made it possible to spread the weight of a vehicle on a much larger surface, and made it possible for the vehicle to move outside a very flat road. In the first decade of the 20th century, these three innovations, armor, caterpillar, and combustion engine, became more widely available and efficient, functional. They were no longer mere prototypes, they worked. So various early tanks projects appeared in the army of several European countries, in Austria, in France, in Britain, in Russia, but all of these projects were rejected by the army. Back then the army could be fairly conservative, and land warfare for centuries had been based on cavalry for the mobility and the capacity to strike quickly, artillery for the firepower, and infantry. Tanks did not really fall into any of these categories, and the generals, the army in general, was quite skeptical this theoretical concept could really be efficient on a battlefield. So all these projects were more or less abandoned, and when the First World War began in 1914, tanks were absent in the armies of all the belligerents. But the First World War changed everything, and so tanks emerged as extremely important weapons on land battlefields. When the First World War began in 1914, opposing the Allies, mainly Russia, France and Great Britain, they were joined later by Italy, and in 1917 by the USA, two central powers, mainly Germany, Austria-Hungary and the Ottoman Empire, Turkey. The doctrine in the armies of every of these countries was based on the mobility and the search for a decisive battle on land. This conception was inherited from the wars of the 19th century. It could be traced back to the Napoleonic era, when the battles were very decisive and could determine the conclusion of a war. They hadn't realized yet that this conception of warfare had become obsolete due to a number of innovations that had taken place in the years before the First World War. These innovations included things like the machine gun, a much more accurate and powerful kind of artillery, and these new weapons made defensive tactics much more efficient and deadlier than before. When the war began, as every army was trying to take the offensive against the other, the first battles proved extremely costly in human terms. They were more lethal than any other conflict in history. For example, on the Western Front, mainly between France and Germany, each country, each army, lost about 500,000 men just in the first few weeks of fighting. And by the end of the first year of conflict, all the generals started to realize that defensive positions were much better, much more efficient and rational than always looking for the offensive, and this war turned into a war of position, the so-called trenches war, as the soldiers started to dig trenches in which they could find some protection against artillery shells and machine guns. For more than 3 years, this war continued as a trenches war, especially on the Western Front, fought along the French frontier from Switzerland to the North Sea. And each side, the Allies, mainly France and Britain, helped by Commonwealth forces, or the Germans, tried to take the offensive to destroy the others' defensive positions by launching overwhelming offensives or by crushing it with artillery fire. But all of these offensives failed, and they include famous battles like the Battle of the Somme, a big British offensive in the north of France, or the Battle of Verdun, a German offensive against a section of the front defended by France. Just a quick digression to mention how these years, 1915, 16, 17, due to their human cost and the incredible degree of destruction that had been reached, contributed to change the mentalities in countries like France, or maybe to a lesser extent the UK. In the 1920s and the 1930s, and maybe even beyond, these countries became very pacifist, which they were not at all before. And this is due to how they realized to what extent modern war could be destructive and deadly. If I take just the example of France, almost 10% of all Frenchmen, France had a population of 20 million men back then, and 40 million in total, were casualties in the First World War. On thousands of square miles in the north and east of France, all along the front line, everything, absolutely everything, was destroyed by artillery shells and the trenches. In total, billions of shells were shot during the conflict, coming from both sides, so much that there are places where entire villages have not only been destroyed, they have disappeared. It has been impossible to find a single stone remaining of what was once a small town or a village. And I remember when I was a kid, because I grew up in the northeast of France, in the region of Champagne, where the front line passed. When we went to the woods or the countryside, we could see this very particular geography. There are holes everywhere, the craters made by explosions of shells, and even though the vegetation has come back, you can still see this particular type of landscape. And we were always told when I was a kid to never touch anything metallic, because there are still plenty of ammunitions, mainly artillery shells, that did not explode when they hit the ground, and could do so decades later. I'm telling you this because you have to figure out how absurdly destructive, how deadly this conflict on French soil was 1 century ago, to understand this pacifism of the years 1920s and 1930s, the reluctance to enter the Second World War. Every French family lost someone in the First World War. Personally, I lost one of my grandfathers. My other grandfather was hurt and lost an arm during this conflict. Every single family was hurt by the war, and this may explain, including today maybe, why there is this reluctance to go to war, engage in a large-scale conflict in many European countries, because they have seen on their soil the destruction that war could imply. I think people from countries like Germany, like Japan, can understand this very well when they see how war can be destructive, and not only theoretically but on their soil and in their flesh. So, returning to my topic, the development of the first tanks really started in the years 1915 and 1916, separately in Great Britain and France, as an attempt to find a response to this strategical dead end on the front the two countries had been. They needed something, a new weapon, a vehicle able to cross the trenches, to support an offensive, and finally put an end to this trenches war in which the countries were stuck. In the UK, the chief of the project would become much more famous in the Second World War and beyond, Winston Churchill. He was already a military man back then, and the British project led to the design of a new tank, the first ever to be engaged on a battlefield, the so-called Mark tanks, which appeared during the Somme offensive in 1916. I told you before about the Battle of the Somme, one of the major offensives of the First World War. These Mark tanks were relatively heavy, 28 tons. They were also very primitive, given how tanks would evolve later on. They were made, and that was a weakness in all tanks of the First World War, of riveted armor plates. This means that the armor plates were fixed to each other with rivets, and that was extremely dangerous for the crew, because every time a shell, something explosive, touched the tank, the rivets could be projected everywhere inside the tank and kill the crew. It was also affected by many mechanical problems. Sometimes it proved unable to cross the trenches it had been designed for. They had this very particular shape that would not be used again on future models of tanks. But however, they contributed to the offensive, and they were just a start, because the development of tanks attracted a lot of interest and attention in Great Britain. The British tanks in the 1920s and 1930s were probably the most advanced. It's only later, in the late 1930s and during the Second World War, that Germany became a leader in this field. When they were used for the first time, these early tanks were here to support troopers. They were walking, advancing with the infantry slightly at the front to provide troops with protection. They were more a support weapon than an independent weapon in its own right. In total, Britain produced more than 2,500 tanks during the First World War. The new models, the Marks 1 and then 2, 3, 4, became better and better, and were more heavily engaged in the last battles of the war, until finally the front line collapsed on the German side in 1918. France also had developed early tanks. They appeared in 1917. There had been early models, very ineffective, like the Saint-Chamond, which had a gun mounted at the front but had a stability problem, or the Schneider tanks. But finally, in 1917, a new design and a revolutionary one appeared, the Renault FT-17, and this design of tanks is important because it created the modern design of tanks with a rotative turret on the top and decent fighting capabilities. This design, the FT-17, was the bestseller of tanks in the First World War and the 1920s. It was sold under license to the US Army to equip it, and many FT-17 remained active until the beginning of the Second World War. It is also during the First World War that this name, tank, was given to tanks, and it comes from an initiative from the British Army to try and keep the project secret by giving it a name that would seem to be uninteresting to spies. So instead of calling it armored vehicle or something like this, it was called tanks, so that hopefully any spy would find it uninteresting, and the name remained. The development of tanks in the First World War was mainly on the Allied side. Germany had no interest in tanks yet, and built only a few thousands. When it created its own design, by the end of the year of the war, it was already too late, and the war was lost. So the conclusion after the First World War was that tanks had not been decisive in winning the conflict for the Allies, but they had proved that they could become very important weapons in modern armies, which is why in the interwar period, in the years 1920s and 1930s, every army in the world started to integrate tanks to its equipment and its strategies. And tanks continued to evolve during these years with better engines, better armor, and innovations like sloped armor. As I told you before, the first tanks had a relatively light armor, and the armor plates were riveted in order to maintain them together. In the 1930s, new designs started to appear with sloped armor, which means that the armor is slightly inclined, and this is good because it can make ammunitions rebound on the armor, and in case they explode, the armor presents a bigger thickness to the ammunition, to the shell, improving its resilience and its likelihood to resist the explosion. In the 1930s too, several nations, especially Germany, Italy and the Soviet Union, the USSR, experimented a lot with their involvement in the Spanish Civil War that started in 1936. There were two sides, the nationalists, supported by Germany and Italy, and they finally won the Spanish War, and the Republicans, supported by the USSR and international volunteers. Various writers and intellectuals participated in the war, went to Spain. Ernest Hemingway is one of them, and tried to make this war famous to attract international support. But Britain and France, that were theoretically the most likely powers to intervene because they were pacifist and not willing to enter a conflict, led finally Republican Spain lose the conflict. They experimented and learned a lot, not only about the material, but also the tactics to use with tanks. And during this interwar period, various people in the USSR, like Mikhail Tukhachevsky, in Britain, Percy Hobart, in Germany, Heinz Guderian, in France, Charles de Gaulle, started to advocate new tactics based on massive tanks offensives, based on a concentration of tanks that would provide the firepower and the mobility to break the opposing army's resistance. Actually, it's only Germany, with the so-called Blitzkrieg doctrine, that would apply this during the Second World War, using mass concentration of tanks to break the front line and then let the rest of the army, infantry mainly, advance. They also started to theorize combined arms tactics that Germany would use in the Blitzkrieg in the Second World War, which means making the various arms of the army, the land army, and its various components, infantry, artillery, tanks, and also the Air Force, collaborate in offensives in order to crush the enemy and react to any of its moves. The Soviets, the USSR, also learned a lot about tanks in its conflict with Japan in the 1930s. There was one very important battle, the Battle of Nomonhan in Asia, between Japan and the USSR, like a quick war between the two countries that ended before the beginning of the Second World War. And in this battle, for the first time, the USSR used a combined arms offensive with air power and tanks to crush the Japanese army. And even though it would not show immediately, when the USSR entered the Second World War in 1941, attacked by Germany, the Soviets had a very good tank they had designed in the late 1930s, the T-34. I will tell you about it slightly later. So in 1939-1940, at the beginning of the Second World War, tanks were now present in the armies of every major belligerent in the Second World War, but with very different tactics. In the British and French armies, tanks were still, like in the First World War, used as support weapons for the infantry. So they were scattered everywhere in the army, with battalions that were helped, supported by tanks, and the communications between tanks were poorly developed. They had no radios, so clearly tanks were not intended to serve as a spearhead to fight the enemy, and on the Allied side, the conception of war remained fairly close to the First World War. On the German side, on the opposite, the theories of several German officers, and especially Guderian, had been taken into account, and Germany had a new way of making war that would later be called the Blitzkrieg, this use of combined arms and an armored spearhead based on a mass concentration of tanks to attack. So actually, in 1940, German tanks were not particularly better in terms of quantity or quality than British and French tanks, but this very efficient tactic and the absence of a well-organized reaction and defense on the Allied side made the front against France collapse extremely quickly. Just in weeks, France was defeated, and only the UK and countries from the Commonwealth remained in the war against Germany and Italy in Europe. The Second World War was the conflict in which tanks took a huge importance in every land battlefield, be it in North Africa and on a huge scale on the Eastern Front between Germany and the USSR. Tanks became the very center of the armies. The number of tanks aligned by every belligerent reached thousands, and the technological race to have the best tanks, the fastest, the most armored, or the best armored, the most accurate, accelerated. The Second World War really, for a large part, was a war of tanks in battles like Stalingrad, in the Battle of Kursk in 1943, the largest tank battle in history. Tanks played a crucial role, and in this technological race to design and build the best tanks during this period, Germany excelled during the Second World War, developing medium tanks. Medium or heavy or light tanks are an indication of the size, the thickness of the armor, and the speed of the tank. So a light tank is supposed to be less armored but faster than a heavy tank, which is going to be very strongly armored and with a very strong destruction capacity. So the Germans developed medium tanks like the Panzer IV and V, and very heavy models like the Tiger I and II, that were by far the best tanks of the Second World War, especially for their precision. They were extremely accurate, and the heavy models like the Tigers could resist most of the shells the opponents, their enemies, had available. It's also during the Second World War that weapons designed specifically to destroy tanks were created. There were tanks destroyers that were like simplified tanks, a platform with a gun specializing in perforating the armor of other tanks, and the so-called HEAT, H-E-A-T, ammunitions that are specifically designed to perforate the armor and explode inside the tank. Actually, this is the development of such weapons, anti-tank weapons, that finally led to the abandon of light tanks that were supposed to be faster and avoid enemy shots, which was possible when the shots were very imprecise, like in the First World War or the 1920s and 1930s, but it appeared during the Second World War that the thickness, the resilience of the armor was more important than speed when it came to the life expectancy of a tank on the battlefield, and light tanks were progressively abandoned. On the other hand, mechanical problems, and especially on heavy tanks, were incredibly tough during the Second World War. Germany suffered a lot from this on the Eastern Front against the USSR. Their tanks were very advanced and accurate, but they often lacked the parts or were unable to operate properly due to the extreme weather conditions and geographical conditions they met on this front. The US also developed tanks, heavily during the Second World War, and the most famous of these tanks, a medium tank, is the Sherman, the M4, that was the second most produced tank during the Second World War. More than 40,000 units were produced and provided not only to the US Army but to its allies too, to the UK, to the USSR, to the Free French forces. The most produced tank in the Second World War, with more than 60,000 units produced, was the legendary T-34, the tank that might not have explained the victory of the USSR against Germany, because there were plenty of other factors, but it played a crucial role. The T-34 was not very complex in comparison with the German tanks. It was much simpler, but in a sense more reliable due to the tough conditions in which each side had to fight. It was cheap and easy to produce. It had a very resilient sloped armor, and even though the T-34 were destroyed by hundreds, even thousands, in the first month of the conflict after the German attack in 1941, Operation Barbarossa, when the Soviet Union managed to stabilize the front line and go on the offensive after Stalingrad, the T-34 was present everywhere in Soviet victories, and it established the USSR as a provider of tanks that were efficient, simple to use, and reliable in every condition. Finally, Germany lost the Second World War, not because of inferior tank designs, but because its industrial capacity was destroyed by the Allies, and the German army lacked the manpower that the USSR was able to mobilize. And finally, Germany was defeated on two fronts, with the USSR advancing until it reached Berlin, and after the D-Day in 1944, the advance of the Allied, mainly US army, in France and West Germany, ending the Second World War on this front in Europe with the defeat of Germany. In the closing stages of the Second World War, this distinction between light, medium and heavy tanks tended to disappear, with the emergence of something called the main battle tank. As I told you before, it appeared that light tanks were finally little useful. It could be very useful to have armored vehicles to transport soldiers, for example, but making a tank with a light armor, even if it was slightly faster, did not make much sense. So, on the other hand, as heavy tanks, very slow and exposed to shots from the air, that's the big weakness of tanks. They are unable to retaliate when attacked from by the Air Force. So medium tanks became more popular, and they evolved towards this main battle tank, a unique design in terms of size. After the Second World War, international tensions continued, of course, with the beginning of the Cold War and an arms race between the USSR and its allies, the so-called Pact of Warsaw, the alliance of the USSR and its Eastern European satellites, and on the other hand, the US and Western Europe. During this period, the equipment of every army in tanks was seen as crucial, so both the US and the USSR provided their allies with tanks that they produced or They provided the designs, and these tanks were produced under license in other countries. The years 1950s, the 1960s were probably the periods in history when there was the most tanks, especially on the Soviet side. Dozens of thousands of tanks accumulated in arsenals, most of them finally never served, but tanks were used in every conflict of the second half of the 20th century, in Vietnam, in Afghanistan in the 1980s, in the Iran-Iraq war, and they became the center of any land army. The designs and the technology obviously continued to evolve. The standards for main battle tanks from the 1950s and after included a 360 degrees rotating turret, so the turret can target anything without having to move the vehicle. They also started to include much better suspension systems, making the tank much more efficient whatever the environment, better engines, giving tanks much more autonomy. That's the biggest tactical problem when you use tanks in an offensive. You have to supply them not only with parts and ammunitions, but just fuel. So the use of tanks, especially on a large scale, implies a complex and very well organized logistical organization. Fire control systems were also improved quite a lot. And finally, famous tanks of the 1950s include the Soviet T-54-55, the British Centurion, or the M48 built in the US. The new generation of tanks that are still active in many militaries of the world today are their successors. There is the German Leopard 2, the Abrams, the M1 Abrams from the US, the Challenger 2 produced in the UK, the French Leclerc, or the Israeli Merkava. However, with the evolution of warfare in the past few decades, the importance of this tank versus tank combat, like in the Second World War, has diminished a lot, and tanks are now much used in more punctual operations. In urban warfare, for example, there are models of tanks that provide protection to a platoon of infantry. They were still used as a spearhead for an invasion, like in Iraq in 2003, for example. About 1,000 Abrams tanks were deployed by the US, but tanks tend to be less numerous and strategically less important than in the second half of the 20th century nowadays. The current R&D continues, and tanks are certainly not going to disappear from modern armies anytime soon. The current axis of research are to improve the detection capabilities using, for example, thermal imagers, automated fire control systems, and there's also much work on the armor itself, using the so-called intelligent materials that are able to react to a collision with a shell, for example, to improve the resilience of modern tanks. Some attempts also try to externalize the armor of the tank by equipping it with a system that can detect and destroy any missile or shell about to hit the tank before it does so. And this would mean the possibility to have much lighter and faster vehicles with finally a better protection. So, as I said at the beginning, this need for mobility, for protection and firepower remains, even though the forms it takes from this design, coming out the imagination of Da Vinci, to the most modern tanks have evolved a lot, but the need remains, and for that reason tanks and their successors will remain, probably for the foreseeable future, very important components of modern militaries. Well, that was just an introduction, and there are so many things, and in particular more technical elements that I would have liked to discuss, but I see that I have already spoken almost 50 minutes, so that's going to be enough for today. As usual, I hope this video for you is just a starting point if you are interested in the topic. You can find so many information on the internet, and I'll see you soon for a new topic. Do not forget to participate in the survey I mentioned at the beginning, and I'll see you soon for another video. Au revoir.